This is Words Aptly Spoken, which comes from Proverbs 25:11. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. The written word is a precious treasure. We want to preserve written knowledge for God's glory and as an anchor to the history of the church and its classical conversations. We hope to encourage the reading of words and of the word.
Welcome to Words Aptly Spoken, where Jennifer Courtney, Timothy Knotts, and I discuss books from the Classical Conversations curated curriculum. It's Wednesday, January 29th, 2025, and I'm Lee Bortons. Tim's traveling today, but we have with us Kathy Denishi, curriculum developer for Classical Conversations Multimedia, as well as our grammar strand writer. And we also have our friend Lisa Bailey, Director of Program Development. So welcome, everybody.
Thank you, Lee.
Thank you, Lee.
Jennifer, as our grand leader here, tell us about this month's theme and what's going on with our discussions.
Well, I think we've just had more fun than human beings should be allowed talking about books for the youngest of learners. And so if you missed any of our shows, we looked at the American language series of phonics readers. There's 6 of them, beginning with Fun in the Sun to help your kids practice their reading. And then we moved on to some readers that our listeners might want to have at their side while looking at cycle 3 if you're in our foundations programs. But we looked at New World Echoes and read some really delightful stories with Lisa Bailey's Southern accent there.
Yeah.
And then last week we talked about how beautiful it is to read about God's creation as families and also go out together outside. And we discussed exploring the oceans with Uncle Paul and did a whole week's worth of reading. So we're giving some good models this month for how you can use these books at home.
Yeah.
And then today we're going to finish up this little mini series with Emperors of Rome.
That's great. So for those of you who would like to catch up on these past episodes where we've had so much fun, you can go to my YouTube channel at Lee Bortons, or even my website, leebortons.com, where we have archives and links not only to past episodes, but also to the books from our sponsor, classicalconversationsbooks.com, where you can purchase the books that we're talking about and use them to either keep up with or get ahead of your children in our Classical Conversations communities. So I'm ready to get going, Jennifer.
Okay, well, you know what I'm going to ask you. Why did we make this little book about Roman history?
So something that a lot of people felt was lacking in the early years of Classical Conversations is we have such a big emphasis on Latin, which is typical of a classical program to either, well, one to work on language no matter what, but a lot of times it's Greek or Hebrew instead of Latin. So we had chosen Latin. And of course, people were reading stories about Julius Caesar and actually written by him and various other historic Roman characters and didn't really know who they were. So it was really important for us to back up and to give we don't want a history course, right? We read history, we live history out, and we like to research original source documents. So you and I, once again, went to the public domain and stumbled on some books about Roman emperors and other Roman citizens and made our trilogy around that time period. So that now as our older students and as well as families of younger children, as they are trying to memorize all those declensions and conjugations, they have an opportunity to learn more about the history and culture of the time period the language is from.
Yeah, and I was thinking about the author of the book that we took these from, Mary McGregor, was a fairly well-known children's author during the early 20th century. So around 1907 to 1940, she wrote these stories for younger learners, and her specialty was the ancient world. And so once we talked last couple weeks about just the importance of preserving good stories too. And these are fun ones to preserve because, as we know lately, well, always throughout time in the Western world, we've thought about our connection to Rome and its history. But lately, there's some funny things going on with, quizzes about how many times a day do you think about the Roman Empire. So it feels like we're at a unique moment of thinking about these stories again. And then I did just want to say that this is part of a three book set. So there's kings of Rome, senators of Rome, and emperors of Rome. And although the stories in those books don't perfectly align with those time periods, we did want to emphasize that those were three important parts of Roman history: the age of the kings, followed by the age of the republic, where they were governed by senators. And then this book we're talking about today, Emperors of Rome, takes that time period when the republic was falling apart and the senators were losing power, and that allowed for the rise of Julius Caesar. So this is not a book, despite its title, it's really leading up to the empire, not covering every one of the Roman emperors. For one thing, most of the stories about Rome's emperors would not make for good reading with small children.
Right. Right.
Violent people in violent times. Yeah, I mean, it'd be funny to write a book called The Emperors of Modern Times.
I know.
See the parallels.
That's what you can do when you retire, Lee.
No.
No.
So now I am. Apparently, because I say no things when I get things done.
That's right.
Oh, well, Kathy Lee alluded to the fact that that number one, you're a serious student of Latin, that you've really, really put in a lot of hours as a student lately. And so we want to talk more. And then she also alluded to the fact that it's good to read and or know about Rome's history when you are studying the Latin language. So talk about what you think a family would gain, even with perhaps older students who are already studying Latin, by reading about these events of ancient Rome.
That's such a great question. I think there are a number of things that a student can gain as far as just the language goes. You know, Latin was the language of the Romans, and it continued. We don't realize that it continued up into the Middle Ages and beyond as the language of science and the language of theology. It makes me think too about the language itself. And the Romans were these great administrators, right? And I think that order that they had a big, lots of order in their society, even though it was chaotic and even though it was ruthless. And I think that's reflected in the language to some degree, the order we find in the language. But I think beyond the language too, I think it's important to know some Roman history, not just because of the language, but also because it integrates with so many other things that affect us today. Um, you know, I think even in Rome today, if you've ever been to Rome, the manhole covers have SPQR written on them, which stood for Senatus Populusque Romanus, which is the Senate and people of Rome. A lot of the monuments have that or other Latin sayings on them. But then we see it in other places. Shakespeare's Julius Caesar tells the story of Caesar's rise to power, which is such an interesting story to me after hearing you talk about the three periods, because the Romans did not want to go back to kings, and here these emperors were coming to power. So, and then again, the Roman Empire stretched all over Europe. There are ruins, Roman ruins, all the way up into Great Britain. In the Middle Ages, I thought about one of our history sentences in 800 during the medieval period. Charlemagne, this is a paraphrase, was crowned Holy Roman Empire of Europe. So it's just all over. But I think one of the best reasons for knowing about Roman history is that that's the time period that God chose to send his son to earth as a man. And so the setting of the New Testament is a people under Roman rule. So Caesar Augustus and the Pax Romanus.
That's really good.
That is good, Kathy. Yeah, I appreciate that. It seems like everywhere you go, you can't escape Rome, as you said. So when our children were quite a bit younger, we took them to Vienna and we went down under the current level of the city to see all the Roman ruins of the garrison that was stationed there. So, but yeah, I really appreciate what you said, particularly when we think about someone like Julius Caesar and the cautionary tale of returning to that more autocratic rule after they had been ruled by their Senate and they had had more say in their government. That's a cautionary tale that rings throughout history and echoes throughout history. So all good reasons to study. All right. So Lisa, let's move forward to the to the challenge years. We spend a lot of time with our kiddos talking about history. So, how do you think this book is preparatory for some things that they're going to be talking about with their community members later in their education?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, context is huge for understanding history. And as you guys have alluded to, so much of our Western cultural history is tied to Rome. So reading Emperors of Rome helps us to develop a good framework for understanding our history, like the why and how of some of the ideas that Western culture was founded on, even that our own country was founded on, ideas about government, about what makes a good leader, um, what makes a man of good repute or honorable character. All of those things are developed. I, I think, and I was talking about this in a podcast that I did actually earlier today in Everyday Educator. We just did a podcast that'll come out in a couple of weeks about what we can learn from studying the characters of books that we read. You know, who do we want to be like and who do we not want to be like? And we learn that from history. That what are the traits of great leaders, the ones that you want to emulate and then the ones that you would rather eliminate, you know? um, Studying history really does allow us to study character and people, and it's good for our youngsters to get familiar with names that they're going to see again. And even if they don't remember all the stories, they remember that they've heard of this person before. And this kind of gives them a feeling that history is a flow. History is a flow. And it's so important, I think, for young children to develop that idea of this was in the past and what I'm living is now, but we're going somewhere, that there's a flow. How did we get here? As our students get older, they think about how did we end up where we are? And for really older students, it can become deeply philosophical, right? But it's easier to answer the how did we get here if you know where we began. And so when you study the character of past leaders or the movements of armies and people groups, then it gives you a rough sketching out of the movement of God and the movement of people through time. So I think it's cool to begin. And they just love the stories. And they remember, everybody remembers things better when you tell them a story than when you just are lecturing them with facts.
I think it'd be a cool exercise to when you're reading some of these stories, then to go find similar rulers in the Old Testament and say,
Yes.
how was Cyrus like the good emperor versus and Darius versus maybe
Mm-hmm.
Nebuchadnezzar and the bad emperors, and
Mm-hmm.
um, just because the emperor isn't a word we use anymore. We use king, but we mean it kind of as a neutral word. No kings are slaying people right now that I know of. But emperors and dictators, authoritarians, they're all through all of history. And
Mm-hmm.
A lot of our listeners are really good at reading the Bible, but maybe don't know how to make the connections forward.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
That's really good. That's truly.
that is good. I was thinking yesterday we had a very interesting conversation in my challenge 2 community because we were talking about the question, what is good citizenship? And we were
Mm-hmm.
actually reading a Socratic dialogue, not a piece, not necessarily a traditionally historical.
Right.
But as the students were wrestling with what makes a good citizen, of course, they stumbled on the question on the flip side of it, what makes for good leaders or rulers? And those two
Mhm.
things go hand in hand. And so reading a lot of these stories helps to add to their definitions and their understanding of their roles and responsibilities when they're in either one of those categories of being
Mm-hmm.
a citizen or being a leader. So,
Mm-hmm.
well, that's probably a good segue to the fact that because these stories are about humans, and because they are stories in many cases about humans who had a lot more power than earthly power than any of us will perhaps ever know, sometimes the characters in these stories are not so great. Sometimes they are actually downright awful. So how do you guys propose we deal with that when we sit and read these kinds of stories with younger children?
I think stories are powerful in teaching
Mm-hmm.
lessons, more powerful than telling them what to do. I think with stories like the ones that are in here, we can protect our children's innocence while also letting them hear about the consequences of sin in these people. And
Mhm.
just reading a story is the best way to do that. But you have to discuss it too. You have to ask
Right,
questions and discuss it with
right,
your children.
right, right. I used to love asking, so why do you think that happened? What did the leader do? What did the leader do that made it either easier or harder for people to obey, or easier or harder for people to do what was right? And I I think it's really good. You can use even stories of people who did bad things or bad things for bad reasons as teachable moments. Um, what might have happened if they had acted differently, or if they were listening to God, do you think they would have done that? Or, just helping our children recognize that even grown-ups make bad decisions and bad choices, and that there are always consequences to choices, even choices made by grown-ups.
And we also, in reading a history book, might either from the author or somebody from the time period represented in the book might think that the person was a bad guy and presented it that way. And then we know that the Bible tells us that what God meant or what men mean for evil, God can mean for good. And so
Mhm.
we can look forward and say, yeah, that was really a dumb thing they did, but they hadn't done it, your grandma wouldn't be in
Yeah,
America, or
yeah,
whatever
yeah,
it
sure.
is that
How did
that
God redeem that?
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
love that. How did God redeem it? That's super good. The other thing that I was thinking about is that sometimes we have character qualities that can be used for good or bad. It talked about Gaius Marius being very bold. That can
Yes.
very easily turn into pride and
Mhm.
arrogance.
Mhm. I can remember when my girls were little, there were times when, you know, one of their maybe leading characteristics would come to the forefront. And it was one of those, Kathy, that could be used for evil or good. And I can remember warning, especially one of my daughters, okay, um, you can use this for God, or you can use this for yourself. You are at a point. So this is the trade, and you are choosing how to use it. And so that's kind of the lesson that you're saying we could use these stories for.
Good.
I want to let our listeners know too, especially if you feel like you're maybe not an experienced student of history, or an experienced read aloud parent,
Mhm.
or an experienced leader of a discussion in your home, that there's a few things to know. One is that the foreword and the introduction give you lots of tips on how to ask some simple questions to get those conversations going. Um, and then the other thing is, one thing I enjoyed in my house, because these stories are only 2 to 3 pages long, is
Mm.
I really enjoyed reading them with all the ages of my kids, because there was that range of being able to recognize the lessons and discuss them with one
Mhm.
another. That was really beautiful. So I appreciate how short they are, so that your oldest challenge students can be right in the room with your very youngest ones, and all having a really good family conversation about, is this a person that we want to behave like in
Right.
our family or not?
No. Good.
Well, are you ready to thank our sponsor, Lee?
I am. All right, thanks classicalconversationsbooks.com for helping this group of women and men when Tim's around to talk about books with me each week. I just really appreciate the ability to make that happen. So you can go to classicalconversationsbooks.com to purchase any of the books discussed. And we have the entire 2023, 2024, and 2025 Words Aptly Spoken calendar at leebortons.com, with links to the Classical Conversations book site, as well as links to the YouTube archives so that you can watch any of them anytime you want to. And, just be aware, if you listen to it, this is your first one, that there's a wide variety of books for all ages and all subjects and all strands. So just kind of glean through the calendars that we have and find something that might spark your interest.
Yeah, that's a great point. We need lots of different books.
Next week, we're going to talk about our favorite, C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And we'll be having some discussions on how to use that book as a resource for students in our challenge literature. All right, so Jennifer, take us into our next passages. I always love it when we read the book.
I know. It's really good. Really fun to read it together. We love reading books together. So in the introduction, as I mentioned, we do have some great helps for how to have conversations at home. So Lee, do you want to read that first excerpt from the introduction for us?
Sure. Starting with not only does the continuity make for hospitable reading, but Marius is a fascinating, enigmatic character. On one hand, he's the underdog whom the people cheer for. He comes from a poor family and he's rough around the edges, proof that an important person can come from modest beginnings. His enemies fear him and he makes Rome feel safe. On the other hand, he's dishonest. He's willing to lie and cheat to reach his political goals. The story of Marius leaves readers wanting to know what happens next. Will he triumph or will he get his comeuppance? Does he lead a happy life? What can be learned from Marius's choices and the consequences that follow?
Well, that's one of our perennial questions in history, isn't it? Do the ends justify the means?
Mm, mm, mm.
Not often.
No.
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
I love it because it does leave the kids wanting to know, so what happened? So what did happen? Because they are always lectured that the ends don't justify the means, and then you can't act like that, or that's not right, or better. So does he get found out? Does he get punished? Do bad things happen because he chose badly? I think it's a great way to leave them wanting more.
Yeah, and I love Stephanie's question here. Does he lead a happy life? Or we might even ask,
Yes.
did he lead a good life? Because even we can have a discussion with our kids about even if someone isn't punished in this lifetime, there are consequences to not living rightly, no matter when those consequences come. And there are consequences for all the people around us. We don't sin.
Right.
You. So, and we also get a good glimpse into the fact that, people are not consistent. That's one of the lessons we have to learn for relationships.
Yep.
So, he is making Rome safe, but he's also, not protecting the hearts of his people by not setting that virtuous example.
Well, it's like Lewis's, oh, good.
No, go ahead, Lee.
Well, it's kind of like Lewis and being asked, King's asked about democracy. And he just chops off all the wheat heads and he's like, there, that's democracy. That the things that we want aren't always really what we want. They just seem at the moment what we want them to be. So we can have an emperor or king who just answers to the will of the people. Think about the 2 Samuel when they begged God for a king, and God, the ultimate king, said, "Okay, I'm going to tell you all the things you're going to do, but you can have one." So we don't always have a good grasp of what's happening around us. Consequences aren't really what we can care about. We really do care about what's going on at the moment.
I liked what you said, Jennifer, that everything is sometimes bad things are done and something good comes of it, and the truth is that sometimes good people make bad choices and sometimes bad people make good choices. And so you're right. There's hardly ever all black and all white, and people change, and sometimes bad people do good things and sometimes good people do bad things. And what do we learn from that? Where's God in that? So
good. All right. Well, that was so once again, I say read the introduction and the forward because that will help you, because they're all first 10 skills that we practice in classical conversations are used on this little 3-page story in the introduction to give you copious different directions you could go based on how your family reacts to this first story. But last week we did talk about the first 5 of those skills. So we talked about the 5 core habits of naming, attending, memorizing, expressing, and storytelling. And that's how we read a story from Exploring the Oceans with Uncle Paul. And so today we're going to move on to the 5 common topics of definition, comparison, relationship, circumstance, and testimony. And you can learn more about those in the Classical Conversations catalog. And we keep it on page 7, just so that you'll always know where it is. But we're going to play with that a little as we go through the story. So Kathy, do you want to read the first part of our story about Gaius Marius?
Yes, I'm happy to. Gaius Marius was born in 157 BC. His parents were humble folk who had to work for their daily bread. Marius grew up knowing nothing of the indolence and luxury that surrounded so many Roman youths of noble birth. His boyhood was lived in a mountain village where his training made him rough, and uncouth, it also taught him to endure hardness and to eat and drink only what was needful for his health. It was many long years before Marius knew anything of the polished manners and indulgent ways of the city. From his youth, Marius was bold and active. As he grew older, his temper would often flash in ungovernable passion when there was little to provoke it. The lad first served as a soldier under the younger Scipio Africanus. He was used to a frugal fare, and to him the simple manner in which Scipio insisted that his soldiers could live seemed only natural. The young soldier's bravery gained the attention of his commander more than once, and it is easy to believe that such notice awoke his pride and roused his ambition. One evening, as he sat at supper, Scipio was asked where the Romans would find another leader when he was no longer with them. "Perhaps here," answered Scipio, and as he spoke, he touched Marius lightly on the shoulder. At these words, the ambition of Marius leaped to greater heights than ever before.
So I'm going to start us with something just surface and I think easy for us to hear as Kathy was reading. What kinds of just facts did you hear about Gaius Marius?
When he was born and
Okay.
into what type of family he was born.
Okay, so yeah, so tell us when he was born.
So he was born in 157 BC, and his parents were very humble. So they didn't have a lot, and he lived in a mountain village where it was kind of rough, and he ate and drank only what was needed for health. There weren't lots of luxuries and treats, and life was not always easy physically.
So when we did that telling about him, what common topic do you think we were practicing?
Definition.
Yeah.
What kind of person was he?
Mm-hmm. Good. Yeah. Good. All right. Well, what kinds of character qualities did we hear about?
We heard that he was bold and he was active, but he also had this temper that would flare up quickly.
So both that and the facts about where he's from require you to automatically compare because you don't know what those words mean. And what's the difference between a rough mountain village versus some sort of indulgent was the word they use, city village.
Oh, good. So you were making a comparison between country and city. What those things would be like. Good.
Well, and the indolence and luxury, and then he had to endure hardness. And so I love it when there are big words like that because your kids don't know those words. Most people don't go around talking about indolence, even if they talk about luxuries. And so, I can remember my little girl's like, "What is that? What does that mean?" And so you give them the definition so that they have something to compare it to. And that's the easiest way to define a big grown-up word to a little kid is to give them something to compare it to.
And then the whole relationship side of things, he's under Scipio Africanus
Mhm.
and as a soldier. And first, I was very happy that you pronounce it that way, Kathy, because I don't know how to pronounce it. So I'm hoping we're right. And
I
having
hope
all
so.
those, and so having all those hard C's made me think about how the English language has so many soft C's.
Mm.
So I was comparing to that, to the relationship between, because we have so many Latin words, like Africa.
Mhm.
Right?
Mhm.
I was thinking too about comparing his life as a soldier with his life growing up, and they both seemed very similar in he didn't have any luxuries, he probably didn't have any nice things to eat.
Mhm. Mhm.
I do wish they would express more the young soldier's bravery. Like,
Mhm.
we don't know yet why he's brave. There's no
Right.
expression of that.
Right. We didn't get the testimony of what he did that made him brave. Yeah. Yeah.
But we know it led to the result of his bravery was that he was noticed by his commander.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And his commander, his testimony was that that Marius was worthy perhaps to be the next leader. So
Mm.
that would stand him in good stead. I mean, that if you get the endorsement of the current leader, then that's high praise.
That's like
And
the testimony of somebody else, right?
yeah, 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 it has a lot of clout.
Hmm.
I guess that's one of those places that we can talk to our children about how they get into trouble because I know I experienced this and my ego soars and my pride goes up versus when maybe, a prophet is without honor in their own country. So the family doesn't even think you're good at anything, right? And so, which is true. Probably neither. You probably are good at something as well as, boy, if you're going to take on this ambitious pride that he's instilled now in you, you better watch out. Things are coming.
Yep.
If you start believing your press, that could be a bad thing.
Yeah, yeah. A legend in their own mind.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right, so let me go. I think we'll read the next little piece.
Okay.
So let's say I'm going to be the reader. Here we go. So this we're still talking about Marius. When he was 38 years of age, he became a tribune, and he at once set himself to win the favor of the people by bringing forward a measure to keep the election of magistrates free from bribery. But the Senate refused to allow the bill to be put to vote. Marius, nothing daunted, threatened that the consuls should be imprisoned if they did not compel the Senate to let the bill take its course. So determined was he that he gained his end. The bill came before the people, and they, well pleased that Marius had compelled the Senate to yield, voted for it, and the bill became law. All right, what do you think about that?
So I'm wondering how bills became law because the way this is written, it makes it sound like the Senate had to put it to the people, the general populace, for a vote, which
Mhm.
would be more of a referendum in a democracy than a
Yep.
republic would be with checks and balances. So I want to know more about why people say the Rome was a republic.
Yeah. Yes. So a lot of times what happens when we read is that more questions arise. And we should encourage that. It shouldn't be a place where we say, okay, but that's not what the story's about today. It's about this other thing. Let the discussion go where the little minds wander, because that's what they will remember and that's what they'll learn. And um asking questions is good, and following the curiosity is the best way.
I find it interesting he's trying to make a bill about honesty come forward by being cruel and mean to the consuls.
Yeah. Yes. And he wanted the people to be able um, to have more freedom, but what he did was compel the Senate to do something. Yeah, that's an interesting comparison right
Mhm.
there. Yep. All right. Any other things? So he's 38 at this point. So look in that paragraph, in those two little paragraphs, what words do you think that you might want to explore or have to define with your kids? So what's a tribune?
Mhm.
So you might, and what's a magistrate? There are
I'm-
lots of things that could propel you into a little bit of digging. Then you've got the Senate, and then you have, like you said, Lee, the bill, and what does it mean to be daunted?
Mhm.
Um, so there are lots of things to explore when we read with our children.
Yeah, I don't want people to have the impression that the way we talk about these things on the show is how we talk with our children. We're trying to give you lots of ideas. If you gave your kids more than two on a book, you'd probably lose them,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
So these are just a variety of options that you have.
Yeah.
Well, and
And,
I'll go, I
no,
was
go
going to
ahead.
say, if you're sitting with very young children reading this, you're not going to go into these kinds of definitions. But if you're
Oh,
sitting together with the whole family and you've got your, upper teen and your middle kids and your younger kids, then asking, what is a senate, what's a consul, and briefly discussing that might be helpful.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you can even ask, as Jennifer mentioned that she so often did with her kids who had a wide range of ages, what do you notice in the story? What do you notice? And what do you notice? And every child is going to notice something different. And what each one notices might be of interest to the one who didn't notice it at all. All right. So our story concludes with the last, and here's the last portion of the story. Okay. Um, in 115 BC, he became, Kathy, what's the best way to say
I
that
would
word?
just say praetor, but
That's what I was going
the
to say,
Latin
but I
word
didn't want to be
would be
wrong.
praetor.
Right.
But
Okay.
for English, I would just say
A
praetor.
praetor. Uh, In 115 BC, he became a praetor, an elected official just below the consul, and was sent to service in Spain. Here he showed that he was a leader of men, for under him the Roman army speedily cleared the land of the robbers that had for long infested it. At this time, those who rose to fame in Rome were almost always either rich or eloquent. But Marius was poor, and he had no gift of speech. Yet these things did not prevent him from looking forward to the days when he too would be famous. And already the people believed in him. He worked so hard and lived so simply that they looked on the uncouth soldier with goodwill. A little later, he married into the family of the illustrious Caesars. This improved his position and added to his growing influence in the state. His wife Julia was the aunt of the great Roman Julius Caesar. Gaius Marius was the lieutenant Metellus took with him to the war against Jugurtha. Jugurtha was king of the Numidians of northwest Africa. All right. So what else do we learn about Marius there?
I'm seeing more circumstance in this.
Okay.
I'm seeing the state of affairs in Rome, that there were robbers that had infested
Okay.
the land or the routes.
Well, and now he's in Spain, which is apparently a part of Rome, which people don't probably
Okay.
think about now.
Yep. Yep. So you would have to maybe you would define the Roman Empire. Maybe you would even pull out a map and show your kids how widespread the empire had become. Because you're right, Spain, it's gone all the way to Spain now. Okay. Good. What else?
I like how the author connects words with power in the same way that money is with power. And that makes me think of our modern influencers on social media who may not be rich, but
Mm-hmm.
people want to listen to them. And then maybe they become rich afterwards. But
Yeah.
that they recognize that oration was just really important in the classical culture of Rome.
Yeah, that's really good.
I'm
That's really good.
I'm interested in how he overcame that, because even though he had no gift of speech, it didn't prevent him from looking forward to the days where he would become famous. Of course, he married into, it sounds like a great family.
Yeah. So I was going to say, what's the relationship of his actions to his success? And then what's the relationship of his marriage to his success? And it looks like it's really interesting. The relationship between his actions and his success probably made him beloved by the common people who could see themselves in his circumstances or where he came from. And then the influence of his marriage on his success probably allowed the upper crust wealthy people to feel like he was more one of them because of his family connection. So, he was getting good vibes from both sides. All right. What do you see any testimony in there? Anywhere that testimony could be used?
Which is even Metellus taking him to the
Mhm.
African wars.
Yep. He was well regarded as an army guy, as a logistics guy, as somebody who could bring order out of chaos. And, that's related to what he did there in Spain. He cleared the land of the robbers that had been there for so long. Good. Good. And like Jennifer mentioned earlier, if you're not sure, you think, oh, okay, that was relationship. Now, what were those kinds of questions again? It's in the introduction. You may not have those on the tip of your tongue, so they're at the front of the book. And you can just remind yourself of the things that you can think on, categories of thought and categories of asking for questions. These are 5 common topics because they're common concerns for anything you want to learn. Anything you want to learn. Okay, any last thoughts that you guys have about emperors of Rome or Marius or reading with your children or any of that good stuff we've covered today?
I just think I love this book because it leaves you hanging a little bit and you want to find
Yes.
out more about the person.
Yeah.
I can see my kids. I have grandkids now, but I could see my kids wanting to read another chapter.
Yeah. Again, I can hear Gideon, my 2.5-year-old grandson. Again, talk about soldiers. Talk about, you know.
The thing I like about the book is that with their emphasis on the person and their short nature, it might be I actually read it and then use it as a story to tell in the car while we're driving.
Mm.
Right? There's other ways to read to your children.
Yeah, that's a really good suggestion. That's a really good suggestion. If you are not one who begins the day every day with morning reading time, there are other times to get these little character lessons or history lessons or thoughts into the minds of your children. That's really good. This has been a lot of fun considering how to use this story to grow our conversations in our families. We appreciate you guys.
Yeah. Lisa, thanks for taking over and hosting for us. And
Sure.
Kathy, thanks for coming. And we just pray that Jennifer, who had to hop off, is everything's fine. And we will see you next week while we talk about one of our favorites, C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. See
Yeah.
everybody then.
All right.
Good.
Keep
Bye-bye.
listening, keep reading. Bye, guys.